Hello and welcome to the Atlanta History Center's virtual author talks. I'm Virginia Prescott from GPB and your host for this series. Tonight I am talking with Anjali Enjeti about The Parted Earth, her new novel about how the effects of India's partition in 1947 rippled through successive generations. You can purchase the book directly from Acapella Books at the link. It's in your chat screen. There's also a link at the Atlanta History Center's website. As Anjali and I are talking, please submit your questions via the Q&A feature. It's at the bottom of your screen, and I will try to integrate as many of them into the conversation as I possibly can. Anjali Enjeti is a former attorney, organizer, and award-winning journalist based near Atlanta. Her writing has appeared in Harper's Bazaar, the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, the Washington Post, Al Jazeera, The Nation, among other places. She's also founder of the Georgia chapter of They See Blue. That's an organization for South Asian Democrats, and she also served on the Georgia Asian American and Pacific Islander Leadership Council for the Biden-Harris campaign. Her collection of essays, Southbounds, Essays on Identity, Inheritance, and Social Change, came out in April, and The Parted Earth just came out today. So congratulations, first of all, Anjali.
Thank you so much, Virginia. I'm so happy to be here.
I'm so happy to speak with you about this book. I was just blown away by it. But it is set, it stretches across decades and across continents, but begins with partition. So it might be helpful to get some context. Why was the Indian subcontinent divided in 1947?
Well, I think the story starts during the British colonization of India, of what was known as India then, which was more of a landmass, the subcontinent. There were not any nations yet. The British were around for a couple hundred years in one form or another. And when they were pressured to quit India and decided to quit, there were various factions who wanted the country divided. What would be the new countries? And so Pakistan, which then consisted of East Pakistan and West Pakistan, became the Muslim majority nation, and India became the Hindu majority nation. And then, of course, later on, there were other countries that declared their independence. But this book takes place in 1947 with that first major division.
Right, so the story is set at first, anyway, in Delhi, where a pair of teenagers, a Hindu girl and a Muslim boy, fall in love, which has a little Romeo and Juliet vibe, except their families are not at war. In fact, there's a picture that you bring of relationships and commerce between people from a number of different religious and ethnic backgrounds. Was that that coexistence the experience before partition?
You know, there has always been coexistence between different faiths. The reality is that despite the fact that partition was such a violent event, resulting in the deaths of 1 to 2 million people, resulting in the largest human migration in world history, there were 15 million people who were uprooted from their homes and had to move across one of the borders. People were living peacefully. Of course, there was always strife between faith groups, between cultures, caste, but people lived also in harmony. And this continued during partition, right? Neighbors helped neighbors, friends helped friends. They hid one another in homes. They protected their personal belongings, helped with the children. So there were still friendships, and Deepa is when the novel opens, she's a 16-year-old teenage girl. So she has on her mind what all teenagers have. She wants to hang out with her friends. She's trying to keep up her grades in school, and she falls in love with another 16-year-old. And that's the center of her world, as well as her parents. And their family's medical clinic. But she has to deal with the fact that the outside world is kind of invading her own home and her very insular relationships. And this is part of her struggle, is trying to be an independent young woman, trying to nurture her relationships with people, trying to perform well in school, but the outside world, the strife and the tension and the violence keep finding their ways in.
Right. We begin to see how the tensions and that otherizing is spreading in this neighborhood that she grew up in and knew so well. How does this manifest? How does it start to creep in Deepa's world?
Well, it first creeps in because Deepa starts to realize that she has friends, for example, who are being harassed, that they might have to move to what would be the new Pakistan. And she also sees extremism within her own community. The novel opens with an incident at her parents' medical clinic, which is in fact committed by a boy that she used to know, who used to be like an older brother to her, who is also Hindu, shares the same culture and faith, but decides that Muslims should be expulsed from India, and in a way that should be violent. So right off the bat, we see in the novel that Deepa is confronted with uh, the dangerous ideology that is seeping through every aspect of everyone's lives close to the border. And she has to reckon with that. She's trying to make sense of the fact that some of the people that she has known for most of her life and has loved and have looked up to are turning. They're becoming people that she can no longer recognize.
Yeah, there is a distinct before and after sense that she goes through, looking at the world that she doesn't really, as you said, recognize anymore. Why are her parents, Deepa's parents, targeted in particular by political violence?
So Deepa's parents are not very religious people. They are culturally Hindu, and that is a faith that the mother somewhat subscribes to. Deepa's father actually calls himself an atheist. He is a non-believer. But they become targeted, as do Deepa's godparents. But Deepa's parents become targeted because they treat patients from all faiths. And so there are extremists in their community who do not believe that they should treat Muslim patients, and they continue to do so. They have very sick patients. They do not feel that they can turn away any of their patients, regardless of their faith. And what they deal with is incidents of violence that start happening closer and closer to their home, to their medical clinic, and they have to make a decision about whether or not they're going to stay open. And in their minds, the only right decision is to make themselves available to whatever patient comes through their door. And this really starts to become an issue for Deepa, who starts becoming more afraid for her parents' safety, her godparents' safety, and her own safety.
Right. And yet they won't leave. And things just ignite so quickly. And that felt really resonant for me reading this in the United States in 2021. I'm wondering about how it felt for you when writing. Obviously, the partisanship, the divides in the United States are not the same. But, seeing the storming of the Capitol, for example, it just felt like things are a lot more unsteady than I thought. I wondered if you had any thoughts about that.
Absolutely. I finished the bulk of this novel a few years ago, but certainly during the last administration, we have seen extremism and ideology take precedent in so many different communities. And we've seen so much hatred, so much white supremacy. And when I was revising the novel, and when I was doing copy edits, it was during Trump's presidency, and it was during, an uptick of violence against the Black community. In the past year, we've had such an uptick in violence against the Asian community. We've seen what's happened to undocumented folks at the border, and at the base of all of it is this this extremist ideology. It's people believing that one group should be prioritized, one group of people's rights, their agency, and their autonomy should take precedence over anyone else. And so I did feel a little bit of a deja vu when, doing revisions for this novel, because this is a common problem. It's been around from the beginning of time. Doesn't matter whether we're talking about, Christian supremacy or Hindu supremacy or any religion that we feel should have the most amount of rights, should be most whole, should have the most ownership over a nation. We see that happening today. So it did feel very analogous to the novel that I was revising at the time.
Jessica asked, how can stories like The Parted Earth help mitigate extremism and hatred?
That's a great question, Jessica. Thank you so much for asking it. I hope it's easier sometimes to see hatred in all of its forms in art. When I wrote the book, in the United States, in any country, all over the world, this is a factor, this is a force that we're fighting. And I hope that art opens people's eyes more if a conversation doesn't work, if a news article doesn't work. I feel like when people read the book, they will have a sense to how contemporary a lot of these issues feel. I mean, look, borders are something that affect everybody in this life. We can think about what's happening down at the US-Mexico border now. In some ways is eerily similar to what was happening with the board near the borders in 1947. Mm-hmm. So I do feel that sometimes art can show us a perspective that is maybe sometimes easier to grasp when you're looking at an issue in a novel or a painting or a play. And that's what I hope comes out of it.
Well, I'd love to know how this story came to you. Your father was born in India. He emigrated along with many members of his family, and you dedicate this to two of your grandmothers. So is there any personal resonance in this story? Did your family experience any of this during partition?
So my father's family is from the southern part of India. So I do not have any sort of ancestral connections to partition. There were large cities in the south near the borders that, for example, took in a lot of refugees, but otherwise did not feel or witness the harshest effects of partition. But the story came from years of me simply being fascinated by this chapter in history. When I graduated from college, I'd heard of partition, graduated from college and didn't have an opportunity to formally study it in middle school or high school or college. And I decided I was going to start reading about partition. So I started with fiction, spent years reading every novel I could get my hand on. Then I moved to nonfiction. And at the same time, I was learning how to use the internet. This was in the mid-1990s, late 1990s. And what really interested me was finding out survivors' testimonies, their first-person accounts of what they went through. My first few searches, I found a lot of articles on partition, but I didn't find those stories of survivors. Mm-hmm. And then eventually I did. And I found various organizations, including the 1947 Partition Archive, where I found these stories. Now, what's interesting is that even though I spent about 15 years reading and researching partition myself, I wasn't even a writer during this time. I had no intention whatsoever of writing a novel. But then in 2011, I had the chance to go back to India for the first time in 19 years. My grandmother was no longer alive. All the other visits before, she and my grandfather had been alive. And on this visit, she wasn't there. It was for a cousin's wedding. We stopped in Agra, where the Taj Mahal is. And when I was standing on the western side of the terrace of the Taj Mahal, I was sort of looking out at the Yamuna River during the sunset, facing Agra Fort. And I recalled that the last time I was in that spot, I was standing with my grandmother, who is one of the grandmothers that I dedicate the novel to. And when I had that sort of feeling, she felt present to me. I felt a spiritual connection with her in that moment. Suddenly in my mind, this image of a grandmother and a granddaughter who had been separated came to mind. And then I spent the rest of my 3 weeks in India thinking about this story. And by the time I got back, I pretty much knew most of the plot of the novel. And then my other grandmother, Gertrude, who passed away just a few years ago, she's Austrian. She inspires one of the characters of the novel. She lived in Austria, in Linz, Austria, during the time when the Nazis had occupied Austria. And while it's fictional what happens to her in the novel, her spirit is certainly embodied in the character of Gertrude in the book.
Pushpa wants to know, were you influenced by other partition writers such as Bapsi Sidhwa? How is your novel different from or similar to Sidhwa's Cracking India?
I loved Cracking India. Well, Cracking India, it's such a special book. It's told from the point of view of a child, and a much younger child than Deepa is when she goes through Partition. But I read as many books as I could get my hand on. So Bapsi Sidhwa's book was certainly probably one of the earlier books that I read. And then, later on, when it became easier to find books that were out of print, that find books that were published in other countries, but not in the United States. Thomas was one of them. I couldn't read it when I was looking for books in the libraries here or the bookstores here, but I found that book later. It opened up a whole new world of Partition novels and Partition short stories and nonfiction. I have a list of some books at the back of the novel. But yeah, every book that I read influenced me in some way. How do you write about violence but don't turn it into tragedy porn, for example?
Yes.
How do you write about trauma in a way that is authentic but doesn't pity the characters, still shows how multifaceted they are? Certainly I learned how to craft characters, especially from many of these novels.
Well, I definitely want to ask more about that, but I want to get to Maria's question because it's related. Now, the novel does follow the unraveling of a mystery that I will avoid giving away. That's for readers to delight in themselves. But she asked, what type of research did you do to recreate this period? You mentioned some of that, but she asked, is the Partition Project an actual initiative? The Partition Project sounds to me like that 1947 archive that you mentioned.
It is. So the 1947 Partition Archive started in 2011, which was actually the same year that I got the idea for the novel and I started drafting an outline for it. I didn't discover the archive yet. I don't think I found the archive until either towards the end of 2012 or early 2013. They have a fantastic website and a Facebook page. And I had been searching these years, trying to find more online testimonies from survivors. And when I found the archive and started reading about it, I knew I had to have some kind of archive be central to the novel. So yes, the Partition Project, which is what I call the archive in the book, is modeled off of not just the 1947 Partition Archive, but there are other archives that came into existence this century, starting in about 2007. And so I wanted to have a kind of ode to historians who do this extremely important work, to the importance of documenting not just our family histories, but our world histories, to the fact that survivors find the strength to talk to people and share what happened to them, with the hopes that something like this doesn't happen again. But yes, I knew when I discovered the archive that I needed to have an archive in the book. And actually, I should put a plug in for this. My press, Hub City Press today, is donating part of the proceeds for the novel to the 1947 Partition Archive if the book is purchased directly through their website.
Wow.
So yes, please check it out if you're not familiar with it. They also have a Facebook page with excerpts from survivors' testimonies. It's so important for us to know and to be familiar with all of these stories.
Yeah, I spent some time on the archive. It is really fascinating. And it really is like in the novel, you think about how various different people who are searching for information about what happened during partition, they come up cold because people have died. There are no answers there anymore. So it's pretty extraordinary. But 60 years later that this archive comes out, that's a long time.
Yeah, I mean, it's a shame because I'm sure there were informal efforts to collect survivors' testimonies, but it really was about 6 decades after 1947 when we started having a more formal, a more widespread effort to document survivor stories. I believe the first archive was the Citizen Archive of Pakistan in 2007. And now we have the Partition Museum. And there are other groups, there are other Facebook groups that are more informal that have started where people share their stories or their relatives' stories, their ancestors' stories in those types of social media forums. But we did unfortunately lose a lot of stories over time. And for some people, it was just too traumatic for them to talk about. The great thing about these historians that collect stories, whether we're talking about the partition or World War II or the Holocaust or any major event that involves a significant amount of tragedy, is that sometimes survivors feel more comfortable talking with a complete stranger than they do sharing it with their families, because a lot of survivors do not talk about partition at all with their children or with their grandchildren or with their with their siblings. And this was how I came to create the character of Deepa, somebody who just simply couldn't talk about what happened to her.
Well, Deepa is among many characters, and she's a young Hindu woman initially. We get to know a little bit more about her later life as well in this book. There's an Indian American woman. We get to know her as an adult and also as a kind of petulant tween, rather. The Austrian woman that you mentioned, she survived a Nazi work camp, a young Pakistani boy, 2 Hindu elders, and they all have these distinct inner lives and responses. How did you get to all of those voices? How did you develop that?
Well, it certainly took a good amount of time. I had from the beginning, I had Deepa and I had Sean pretty solidly in my mind. They are both completely cut off, not only from each other, they are cut off from their families completely. Sean and Deepa are estranged. Sean is 41 years old when the novel starts, and for most of the book. And she doesn't even know where her grandmother is living. And Deepa, she went through some tragic events in her life, and then she basically decides to never talk about it with anyone again. So the question that I asked myself was, how do you get 2 people to care about one another who are estranged after decades? What would get them to at least attempt to inch closer to one another? And I wanted to do this through other characters. So Sean, for example, close to the beginning of her story, she has a miscarriage, her marriage implodes. She feels very alone in the world. She had recently lost her job, so she has nothing when her section of the book starts. And she comes to get to know a neighbor she finds standoffish until that point, annoying, someone who has nothing in common with her. And they develop a friendship, and this character, Chandani, ends up sort of poking around in Sean's business until she starts to understand how disconnected Sean is from not only her family members, but her entire Indian heritage. Sean's father had passed away when she was a child, and he was the Indian parent. And he had abandoned her even before he passed away and moved to India out of the blue. So Chandani becomes Sean's portal to not only processing the grief, that the present day grief that she's experiencing from pregnancy loss and separation from her husband, but also processing what all she lost of her culture and of her ancestry. And Deepa's in a place where she essentially it moves away from India and just seals off that entire part of her life that took place during partition. And she comes to meet a woman who has a very different life, Gertrude, but has also had similar types of losses. So I had to imagine secondary characters that had really compelling stories and really compelling voices in order to unlock these other main characters who had completely divided themselves, right? Their lives were the before and the after, and they had no interest in delving back into their pasts or trotting out their lives decades earlier. They just wanted to survive that moment and to go forward. So I had to find characters that were really going to help them start to sort of unspool their pasts. So I created people that were also in places of their lives where they were feeling deep pain and grief, and trying to connect with anyone that could possibly relate to that.
Yeah, the effects of trauma, how it reverberates throughout a life in individual and collective ways, is very strong. The grief, the violence, the deprivation that people witness. I think in the book you say something about Deepa being her Shan, who is her granddaughter you mentioned, Shanti, finds her unknowable. And the way that people turn inward, how they...
Hi, I think we lost Virginia for a moment, Anjali.
Well, I can talk. Should I keep talking?
Yeah, and I'm gonna get in touch with Virginia. We have some great questions in the Q&A, so feel free to hop over there and we'll get Virginia back shortly.
So where Virginia was going was that there is one instance in the book. There's one time that Sean has met her grandmother. And in that moment, she finds her to be such a cold human being. Sean is like 10 years old. She's flying with her father for the very first time to India. And she meets this woman who just is interesting and warm as wallpaper. And that's the only time she knows her. And so the characters have a lot to overcome if there isn't even the slightest chance that they will ever meet again someday. Oh, I can't hear you, Virginia.
The other woman that you mentioned, Gertrude, who was Austrian, also went through traumas in World War II. And there's a kind of connection there. You know, we know a lot about the experiences of people who survived World War II because there's a lot of documentation there. And we also know a lot of the historic events that led to that. And I've got a question here from somebody who wants to remain anonymous about, you know, she said, or this person said, I'm embarrassed that I did not learn much about partition when I was in college. Are you trying to, in some ways, link, you know, these world events that were going on almost subsequently, but we learn about some and not about others?
Absolutely. Look, there's absolutely nothing to be embarrassed about. There's a lot of history in the world that I don't know anything about, so there's nothing to be embarrassed about. The truth of the matter is that people who do not have South Asian roots tend to not know anything about partition. I mean, I think generally speaking, people have heard of Gandhi, for example. They knew that the British were in India for some time and then left. But a lot of people don't know about partition. And I think, Virginia, part of it is because maybe there were so many things happening at the same time, right? I mean, between the 1940s, if we just look at that one decade of the 1940s, right? There was one thing after another. So that's part of it. I think another part of it is that, we tend to not learn a lot of history that happens to countries where there are Black and brown people. World War II happened in Europe. I mean, this is what we are told is part of our history as people living in the United States, as people, for some people who have ancestry in Europe. We talk about the Holocaust, but I do think that the way we prioritize world events, we tend not to know enough as much about events that happen in countries that are South Asian or Southeast Asian or South American or African, and I do think that's part of it. I know that my children have learned some in school about partition. Not a ton, but they have been introduced to it in their history classes, which is a step up. But it's still a shame how little it's taught in any kind of formal education, and how little attention it gets, because there is a really vast library of books about partition. There are people writing about it in multiple countries. But I do think it would help if it was sort of treated as a world event to the same degree as world events, especially those happening in the same decade.
Mm-hmm. Darby wants to know, I know you have this at the end of your book, but also asks about all the books I've read about partition are fiction. I can't wait to read yours. What nonfiction books would you recommend to give me a deeper historical understanding?
You know what? There's several of them, and I'm going to cheat, and I'm going to look.
You're allowed to look in your own book, I believe, Anjali.
Okay. So one of my absolute favorites, it's a must read, is The Other Side of Silence, Voices from the Partition of India, Urvashi Bhutalia. Excellent book. So Urvashi's book was the first book I came across, and one of the few books, actually, that I'm aware of. I'm sure there are others published in South Asia, but this is the first book that I came aware of that has extensive accounts of survivors in it. She talks to an uncle, she talks to other people that she meets, and so you get several paragraphs to several pages of people telling what they went through. It's a beautiful book. I highly recommend it. Let's see what else is in here. This biography is exquisite. It's called The Pity of Partition, Manto's Work, Life, and Times Across the India-Pakistan Divide. It's by Aisha Jalal. This is, Manto was a extremely prolific short story writer, and many of his stories were about partition. And this biography really captures his creativity and his spirit. And to know his stories and to know the story of his life is to really learn a lot about partition from the nonfiction side. I loved Yasmin Khan's The Great Partition, The Making of India and Pakistan. It came out maybe 5 or 6 years ago, maybe 10 years ago. It's a great primer. I would say that if you were going to look for nonfiction, you might start with The Other Side of Silence and The Great Partition. It really sort of gives you the lay of the land of what happened. And let's see what else. I'll bring up In Freedom's Shade by Anis Kehwa. I would highly recommend that book as well. So those are some of them. But there are so many books out there. And of course, if you get a chance to go to the 1947 Partition Archives Facebook page or interact with the website, it really is, you get something really special when you hear people's stories in their own voices. It's different than what you read in history books. It's different than what you read even in textbooks or in newspaper articles. yeah, so I highly recommend it.
Well, how about for you? You are somebody who's known for writing essays about social justice and dealing with political topics and things that are very present in our lives now. What could you do in a novel that you couldn't do in an essay or a nonfiction work?
You know, I think what I love about fiction is that it allows you to take risks. It allows you to explore darker emotions, the darker side of human beings. It allows you to explore cruelty a little easier. At least I think it is. I think it's very hard to write nonfiction about violence. I find it extremely difficult. I rarely ever write about it. Because it stays with me. I think in fiction, I feel like I'm allowed to examine violence from a safer place. I'm allowed to write about it and then kind of put it out of my mind until the next time I come and take a look at the manuscript again. And writing about partition and the violence in partition, it's not a large part of the book. Most of the book actually doesn't take place during partition, but it was easier for me to look at it head on. I mean, anytime that you're looking at like the darkest corners of what human beings can do, right? The most violence human beings can commit. To me, it's easier to see it, to understand it, to write it, to really delve into the emotions behind it. If it's fiction, it just feels like it hits too close to home sometimes when it's nonfiction.
Mm-hmm. Well, Coney was apparently as taken with the idea of you writing of someone who was unknowable as I was, and asked, could you elaborate on finding the unknowable in your personal life?
Oh my gosh, that is such a deep, deep question.
Thank you, Coney.
So I will say that I think finding the unknowable is a very deeply personal, long journey. And it took me until I turned 40 before I could start figuring it out, before I could really understand. Sean in the novel is 41 years old on purpose. That was very intentional. I started asking questions about my own identity and my own heritage and my own culture more so when I hit my 40s than ever before. Sean in the novel, for example, is biracial. She's half Indian. Her father is Indian and her mother is white. And she feels a little bit discombobulated by being somebody who is biracial. I started considering this more, what it meant to be multiracial. My father is also Indian, as is Sean's, but my mother is half Puerto Rican and half Austrian. So I started asking a lot of these questions about my identity. And for me, searching about what the unknowable is and trying to understand people's pasts and their joys and their traumas really comes down to understanding one's identity, figuring out, who you are, where you come from, what does that mean? How has that shaped your life? What about the parts that you don't know, right? We all have ancestors that we don't know about. We don't know their stories and their histories. We have older relatives who are still alive. Perhaps we've not had the chance to ask them, what was your childhood like? What were your dreams when you were growing up? And I think it starts there in trying to account for ourselves and trying to account for our own histories in order to understand who we are. And this is a journey that, I spend a lot of time thinking about it, but didn't really get to the heart of it until I hit my 40s.
Yeah, there are a couple of other characters. There's another character, Kush, who also in his 40s wants to understand where he came from. And he's abandoned his heritage, I think, in some ways to become more American, which is an impulse a lot of people have. But so along with wrestling with identity, there are a lot of women, there are so many women in this book without men. It's not male centric at all. Through divorce, death, there are a couple of elderly women who we don't hear a lot from in our culture anyway. Well, what does this bring, this telling this story through women, bring to an historical perspective and to a sense of the novel?
I have always thought about women as the keepers of our family history. I've always saw them as the people who tell the stories about the generations that came before, who pass down the heirlooms to their children and grandchildren, who hold the family together in times of strife, in times of division, in times of violence. And who are the ones who, after some terrible tragedy, have the strength and the foresight and the ability to rebuild new lives again. And this book, I wanted it to be an ode to women in their twilight years, to women who live very long lives, but lives that are not resolved, who have hung on as long as they can, but still have so many questions about their lives that they haven't been able to answer, have so many disconnections between people that they've not been able to mend. They are the ones who have the memories and who make sure that people that come after them inherit those memories. So I wanted the book to reflect that Sean is very much a product of those who came before her, as is Cush, and the later generations. And I wanted them to get to know what their histories were through the women, because I feel like they are the ones that often hold these histories closest to their heart.
Yeah. There is a teacher, Madam Grover at Deepa School, who tells her, because she's an aspiring writer, she says, your writing will keep your parents alive. What do you think you're keeping alive in The Parted Earth?
One of the things that I really wanted to write about honestly and authentically was trauma, and I wanted to honor characters and people who could not get past their trauma, let's say, get past in quotes, who could not overcome their trauma, whose healing was not a straight line. And in fact, it was a circle. It was maybe 2 steps forward and 3 steps back. And I wanted to respect that in drawing all of these characters. And Deepa, she learns to love writing when she's young, and it's her writing that really tethers her life. It's what keeps her going. Yet at the same time, she is trying to forget in her everyday life what has happened to her. So in the book, I wanted to honor all the ways that people don't necessarily move on, because that's okay too. It's okay to not be the kind of romanticized survivor that you hear about in the movies, right? It's okay to be the sort of imperfect individual who is struggling and doesn't get the kinds of resolutions in their lives and doesn't arrive at the kind of peace that they really deserve.
This is a question for 4-year-old Sami, who is watching and wants to know why you write. Why are you writing?
So when I'm writing creative nonfiction in the form of essays, or when I'm writing fiction, in other words, when I'm writing anything that's not reporting, I am writing to feel less alone in the world. I am writing to feel a connection to something bigger than me. I'm always searching for that. I'm searching for similarities between myself and other people. I'm looking for similarities between communities of people. I'm wanting to write to understand myself, and I'm wanting to write to understand my place in the world.
Your publisher is dropping in to ask, after releasing 2 books in 4 weeks, what are you working on next?
Oh, that's such a good question.
That's from Meg at Hub City Press, by
All
the way.
right, Meg. So let me preface this by saying that this pandemic has really taken a sledgehammer to my creativity. So what I am working on, and let's define that very loosely because most of it is in my head, is I'm working on another novel. It is a story about two strangers who in the 1970s, they are living in two different continents, don't know one another at all, but they have moments where they each exercise very bad judgment. And that bad judgment results in dire consequences for other people. And in the 1980s, these two strangers who are holding on to a lot of regret and guilt meet for the first time in the North Georgia mountains, which is the tail end of Appalachia. And they begin a relationship, and one that doesn't turn out too well. And so it's certainly much smaller in scope. The book does take place in a few different continents, like the Parted Earth, but not as much. It is very much what I think of as a very Southern story. It's a small town Southern story. The people at the heart of the novel are immigrants, but it really is about sort of living in a small town, but struggling with these really bad events in their lives where they were partly responsible for them and sort of trying to escape from them in some way, only to have them come back up again and it become a present day problem for them.
As history does. In fact, in the novel, one character predicts this unrest could go on for days, weeks, even months, and that was, 60 years ago. Mm-hmm. This is a forced migration on such a huge scale. And you write about the legacy in this one family, but how do you look at it from a more holistic point of view? What is the legacy of that partition for us today?
I think the legacy of all world events, whether we're talking about partition or whether we're talking about the Vietnam War or the Holocaust, it is a very present day legacy. I mean, what happens during these periods of history transcends time. It transcends generations. It transcends borders, right? People of the diaspora, generations later, whether we're talking children or grandchildren or great children, they go out into the world. They leave their homelands. And they live with these histories. I mean, partition today, it's today. I've had so many people who have read excerpts of the book or interviews of the book who have written to me already and said, this happened to my grandfather. This happened to my great grandmother. This is what, this is why we don't know what happened. We just know that they escaped, but we don't know what the stories were. They passed away before we could hear them. So people today, whether they are living survivors of partition or whether they are descendants of partition, are living with partition. It has very much shaped their lives. And I think this is the legacy of any historical event, right? We can even talk about slavery here or the Great Migration. And we can talk about, the ongoing genocides of indigenous peoples here. These are, what happened in the past is very much a present day event. The legacy is felt. And this is true with the case of Sean. Sean doesn't even know she's a descendant of someone who experienced partition, but we still see how the legacy of partition ended up playing a very big role in her life when she didn't even know she had a relative who lived through it.
It is a fascinating book. I want to congratulate you again on the release of The Parted Earth today. Anjali, thank you so much for speaking with us.
Thank you so much, Virginia. It was my pleasure. And thanks so much to everyone for attending.
Yes, thank you so much for being here. We do encourage you to support your local bookseller and purchase your copy of The Parted Earth from Acapella Books. Anjali also mentioned that proceeds from sales at Hub City Press go to the 1947 Archive Project. She also has a new collection of essays called Southbound that came out last month. So although she says the pandemic has been tough for her creativity, she's crushing it on the publishing scale right now. And please do join us for another virtual author event this Thursday, May 6th. Michelle Zauner is going to speak about her new memoir, Crying in H Mart with Chanel Miller. And next Thursday, May 13th, I'm going to talk with the New York Times opinion columnist Charles Blow about The Devil You Know. It's just a powerful call to action for Black Americans to amass political power, fight white supremacy, and reverse migration and move back to the South. You can find a full schedule of Author Talk events at atlantahistorycenter.com. Thank you again so much for joining us this evening, and come back and talk to more authors in the future. Good night.